Um, sorry. So it was almost like a new age influencer whose words were enough to make changes happen. And now we're now working towards continuing his legacy, and thus have jointly developed this session with SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute, and Foundation Avena on designing an effective loss and damage finance track. And as we gather here today, the urgency of addressing the consequences of climate change induced loss and damage has never been more apparent. And thus, despite international commitments, vulnerable communities continue to face escalating costs with limited financial support. And through this session, which underscores mainly the critical need to mobilize resources tailored specifically for loss and damage initiatives, we will explore innovative strategies, examine existing financial mechanisms, and foster collaboration to ensure equitable distribution of funds. And thus, we will hear from a number of researchers on different perspectives on how loss and damage finance, which has been recently developed, it should be operationalized, as well as from some of the local organizations and actors on their valuable work and insights. Our collaborative efforts hold the key to building resilience and providing timely assistance to those who are most affected by the ravages of climate change induced losses and damages. So, with that, first, I would like to introduce Zoha Shau. She is a scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute and working in the Equitable Transitions Program. So, Zoha, over to you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I'll just quickly share my screen. Hope you can hear and see me.
नहीं पता
Okay, hope you can see my screen now. Sorry, that took a second. So I'm just going to present some research that we did together with ECAD and German Watch and some other partners on operationalizing the Loss and Damage Fund, learning from both funder and recipient perspectives. The findings of the research have been published last year in these two key reports. The first was on findings from intended recipients or beneficiaries of the Loss and Damage Fund, where we kind of gathered perspectives from those who the fund was intending to target. And the other, led by German Watch, was more focused on learning from existing funds and funding arrangements to see what could be replicated for the Loss and Damage Fund. And in terms of methodology, we started by conducting a desk-based review of key multilateral climate development, humanitarian, and philanthropic funds, which to basically gather lessons and learnings for what could be replicated for the Loss and Damage Fund and what could be left behind. And also conducted interviews with representatives of a lot of those same funds to basically gather their perspective on what has been working well and what has not been working well, and how the Loss and Damage Fund could adapt some of those structures. We also interviewed a couple of members of the Loss and Damage Transitional Committee to kind of get their perspective on the fund and use that as a way to think about the political feasibility of some of our recommendations that were emerging from the research. From the recipient side, we conducted these 4 online regional focus groups, which were led by ECAD in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and SIDS. And we really here aimed to target actors that are not normally engaged in the negotiations or the UNFCCC process, and focus more on those who would actually be receiving loss and damage finance. So national government actors, but also local governments, local funders, and local NGOs as well. Sorry, there was a bit of noise. To basically gather their insights on how they think the Loss and Damage Fund could be designed and how it could best fit their needs and priorities. We also asked them about some of the barriers and challenges that they face to accessing loss and damage finance, as well as the activities that they would use it for and that they're already kind of implementing to address loss and damage. And then we also kind of observed some of the transitional committee meetings and other UNFCCC processes to kind of keep on top of discussions on the loss and damage fund and try to feed into that process. So I'll highlight kind of 5 key recommendations to put forward to the Loss and Damage Fund board now, as they're still deciding the exact structures and mechanisms of the fund. The first is around accessibility and how, we've heard repeatedly that, countries often struggle to be able to access and be eligible for existing climate finance through existing funds. But those countries and communities within them are often also the most vulnerable to climate change and are the ones facing significant loss and damage impacts. And so they should not be left out of the eligibility criteria of the loss and damage fund. One way to deal with this could be for the fund to have specialized windows with lower access requirements and smaller amounts of funding that are specifically targeted to countries with lower capacity or smaller countries or conflict-prone areas. And then as these countries, meet increasing requirements, the funding could be scaled up over time. So more of an iterative trust-based approach here. You could also have lower due diligence requirements for entities that are already accredited to existing funds, such as the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund, for example, as well as specialized windows for local NGOs to be able to access funds, such as a small grants window, which could also have kind of lower accessibility requirements that local NGOs would have more capacity to meet. And one example to learn from here is the Jeff UNDP Small Grants Program, which enables civil society organizations to directly access grants for community-based projects without necessarily having to go through the kind of accredited entity or government actor within their country, which is how the GCF or the Adaptation Fund Enhanced Direct Access Program works. So it's a slightly different modality that is more directly accessible for CSOs. The second key recommendation is the need for a flexible and grants-based approach. We've already heard repeatedly the need to prioritize grants rather than loans so as not to increase the debt burden on a lot of recipient countries. And the other key important aspect is for finance to be much more programmatic and flexible than how climate finance works currently. Because the project-based model of financing often doesn't work for loss and damage when realities shift and change on the ground over time, and it's hard to plan and predict what loss and damage is going to look like in a little project that ends, and you need kind of longer-term recovery and support. And so finance could be provided as more direct budgetary support to governments to enable them to use it according to their own national plans and policies, with flexibility to allow them to change plans over time, but accompanied by somewhat stringent accountability measures and transparency measures to make sure that funds are still used as intended, even if provided as direct budgetary support. And one example to learn from here is the pilot programs for climate resilience, which also adopts a programmatic approach to funding and makes sure that climate change is mainstreamed into national plans and policies. Third, we've also heard repeatedly about the need for finance to reach the local level. And I've mentioned before a small grants window, which is included as a potential option in the final decision text for the Loss and Damage Fund that was agreed at the last COP. But either way, I think it's important that in addition to government support for loss and damage, which would be useful for larger scale reconstruction and recovery, such as, infrastructure rebuilding following a flood or something like that, there's also a need for finance that goes directly to local actors and communities to enable their recovery and to also give them autonomy and decision-making power to utilize funds according to their own needs. This would also be paired with more kind of knowledge and capacity building support where that allows local NGOs and actors to be able to manage and access these funds as well. So the Loss and Damage Fund could have a component of that, or the Santiago Network could come in and have a component of that, which would then allow these local actors to access and manage the funds. You could also require governments as a kind of basic access criteria for the fund to have community engagement processes, such as, when they're developing whatever proposal for the Loss and Damage Fund, or when they're developing plans to implement loss and damage finance, or you could require that a certain proportion of funds that the government receives is directly dedicated to reaching the local level. One example to learn from here is the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, where funding is distributed to subnational levels through these country coordinating mechanisms, which are these national committees that include representatives of all sorts of different actors, including both government and non-government actors, civil society, affected communities, and the private sector. And so they kind of collectively decide how funding that is received by a country is distributed. The fourth recommendation is the need for participatory and representative decision-making approaches along the same lines as before. It is unfortunate that the board of the Loss and Damage Fund is not going to have representatives of civil society as part of it, or representatives from communities as part of it. But it is still important that those who are most affected by loss and damage have a say in how the funding is utilized. And so one way to do that could be through a multi-tiered governance approach, where in addition to the board at the global level, you have kind of subnational or national or thematic or regional boards that are responsible for actually distributing the funding and deciding how it is used. And those boards could be much more representative and include representatives of different communities. And one example to learn from here is the Global Green Grants Fund, where they have these 24 regional or thematic boards that are made up of different volunteer experts, including community organizations, which then collectively decide how the funding is used. I think the up for debate still within the Loss and Damage Fund context is these kind of trigger-based systems, and whether an extreme weather event occurring could automatically trigger funding and disbursement. This could take place also at the subnational level. For example, funding could be held by some national entities and then triggered as dispersed when an event occurs, for example. Sorry. Finally, then there's a need to also adopt comprehensive and full spectrum approaches. I think Ines will talk about more concrete examples of this later, but one of the key findings from our research also was that it's very difficult to distinguish between adaptation, resilience, humanitarian support, and loss and damage on the ground when actually implementing loss and damage finance. The boundaries between them are very blurred. And so it doesn't always make sense for funding to come from different sources and be used for different activities in a disjointed way when we really want them to be building on each other. And at the same time as we are recovering from loss and damage, we also want to be building future resilience and taking into account future climate risks when it comes to kind of relocation or migration, for example. And so there needs to be some form of continuity within these existing funding streams to build longer term resilience and adaptive capacity. And the Loss and Damage Fund could include, for example, a specifically dedicated coordination mechanism for that purpose. One example to learn from here is the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which provides these country-based pooled funds for longer-term, persistent, and predictable situations in different countries. So donors contribute to that specifically, and then it is used over time as situations occur. So that could be an example to learn from. My final point is just around trade-offs and basically to say that depending on how the fund is designed, there will be trade-offs one way or another. For example, the fund could have a broader scope where it covers all the different aspects of loss and damage, but this like economic and non-economic, slow onset and onset, but this would require more investment in coordination between these different activities and streams, or it could have a much narrower scope, such as only medium to long-term recovery, which would require less coordination, but would be much more narrow and not cover the full aspects of loss and damage. The fund could have a more, participatory decision-making approach with more consultations and community engagement, or it could have more of a kind of devolved governance approach where it actually gives decision-making power to those who are affected. It could be highly inclusive, but this could delay rapid decision making, and well, depending on which level or scale that this is done at, it could delay rapid decision making and the urgency of addressing the problem, or it could have more of these trigger-based type systems, but this could risk truly inclusive and participatory decision making. It could, be very accessible and not have super stringent requirements for access or reporting, but this could risk, proper transparency and accountability, or it could have stronger oversight with more strict mechanisms, but this could then risk certain countries and communities not being able to access the fund. So those are just some trade-offs that the board will have to consider going forward. So I will stop here, but happy to answer any questions later, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Zoha, for the excellent overview of how the Loss and Damage Fund is at currently and the way forward. So next, I would like to request Ms. Aisha Dinshaw. She is the Loss and Damage Program Officer at the Climate Justice Resilient Fund, CGRF, and the programs, she mainly focuses on CGRF's grant making on loss and damage and supports learning and advocacy based on the grants made. So Aisha, we would like to hear from you some perspectives from the donor end on how you are seeing that Loss and Damage Fund can be operationalized. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nusrat. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and present on this panel. I'll just quickly introduce CGRF and then give some thoughts on mobilizing additional finance for loss and damage. So CGRF is a pooled fund, which means we get funding from government and philanthropy, and then we use that funding to make grants to support communities on the front lines of climate change. And what we do is support communities through our partners to really identify and implement their own solutions to address climate impacts, including loss and damage. So our approach to operationalizing loss and damage funding is grounded in a climate justice approach. So as I noted earlier, we provide grants to our implementing partners that are at the local level, most often CSOs or NGOs, but sometimes we do work with international partners who have their own trusted local or organizations. And these grants are all time-bound, and each grant has a specific focus. For example, to support a community that is addressing loss and damage after two back-to-back cyclones, or to devolve decision-making around loss and damage finance to youth so that they can make grants by youth for youth. So each grant is quite specific and time-bound. And the actual work that is implemented is determined through community-driven processes. So communities themselves, with their local partners that we fund, identify their needs, their capacities, and how they want to address their needs and address the loss and damage that they face. So before going further in the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge the very big difference between the scale of funding that is available and the scale of funding that is needed. And we know that this need is only going to grow. So I think keeping that in the back of our minds is important because, as we talk through what has been done and what's needed, there's just this big gap there. And thinking how to bridge that gap is a critical piece of the puzzle. So CGRF makes mid-sized grants, and what we mean by mid-sized is in the $250,000 range. sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And in some cases, our partners that we work with will re-grant. So they'll make smaller $10,000, $50,000 grants. And although these grants are fairly modest in size, what this allows us to do is to really test approaches and test methodologies to address loss and damage. And here I mean both how we center climate justice, how we use participatory, non-extractive ways to address loss and damage, but also what. So what do communities and what do local partners need and identify as solutions to address loss and damage? So these grants are not meeting the scale of the need, but they're allowing us to innovate and test and take some risks to figure out what it really looks like to fund loss and damage. So I'm going to share sort of 3 points around what we can take away in terms of mobilizing additional funding for loss and damage. And the first one is really around learning. So we invest very heavily in learning and sharing the lessons learned and feeding them into advocacy processes. And doing this really maximizes the effectiveness of loss and damage funding because we're not reinventing the wheel. We're sort of leapfrogging over things we've already learned from the adaptation space, but also from these small grants that we have been able to implement. An example of this learning is a current exercise that stemmed from conversations with a couple of donors. And these donors were interested in understanding how CJRF's migration portfolio, which goes all the way back to 2017, fared. And so, these donors are interested in mobility and migration, and we are able to sort of support their decision-making around funding these streams of work by looking back at our existing set of grants on migration and mobility and linking them with loss and damage and seeing what worked, what didn't work, what can we learn from them, and how can we influence future funding that will come at the intersection of loss and damage and climate mobility. Another example is our work last year with our implementing partners who were actually implementing loss and damage projects around the world to identify policy recommendations. And we wrote a brief for the Transitional Committee's 3rd meeting, and I presented some things at the 4th meeting to really try and feed into that Transitional Committee process as it was going in in real time. So this was sort of our learning by doing and sort of real time feeding into policy making attempt. And then later you'll hear from some other lessons from research done in conjunction with Zoha, who just spoke, and Inez will speak next about our grants. And they really did a fantastic job digging deep into our loss and damage portfolio and seeing, again, what was working and what wasn't. The second point I want to make is around the different roles that different actors can take and how this can enable resource mobilization to different ends, because not all loss and damage funding needs to sort of go through the same channels and have the same goals. So here I'll focus kind of on 2 roles. One is the role of first movers, and then the other is the role of longer term funding. So in terms of first movers, as you know, at COP26 in Glasgow, the Scottish government and a small set of philanthropies made the first funds explicitly available for addressing loss and damage. And some of this funding is what has enabled the CJRF grants and the learning that I've already discussed. And these first movers played a really important role in building that momentum for loss and damage and helping us achieve the loss and damage fund at COP last year. So they played a really critical role in supporting that momentum. But now that we have a loss and damage fund, it's really important that those contributions to the fund are not ad hoc, right? We need to have some mechanisms in place for predictable and continuous replenishment so countries and communities can trust and rely on funding that is more commensurate to their needs and that is there. And this should include both developed country contributions, but also innovative sources of finance. So that's sort of the different roles that need to be played in terms of mobilization of funding. But even during the time that the loss and damage fund modalities are being decided and operationalized, I think it's important that the mosaic of solutions, other mechanisms of getting funding out, aside from the loss and damage fund, really continue to be funded, because this allows us to do that testing and innovating and ensuring that there is direct access for communities. So all those things that Zoha said that may or may not be achieved from the loss and damage fund, if they're not achieved, or if they're not achieved fully through the loss and damage fund, we need to make sure that there are modalities and mechanisms for it to be achieved. And the last point I want to make is around collaboration. And really this echoes some things that I've already said. But one thing that's been very clear to me through the last couple of years of working to implement loss and damage funding is that we really can't do everything at one time. And so collaborating is critical. We partner with many types of organizations. We have implementing partners on the ground, learning partners, research partners, advocacy partners. And then in terms of funding, we've worked with different types of funders, including philanthropic funders, government funders, and other intermediary funds that are similar to CGRF. And collaborating is key to kind of ensuring we can keep this momentum going and ensuring that it's possible and meaningful to fund loss and damage now, and to share those lessons learned and to continue to advocate together. So I'll close here and just want to say thank you for the opportunity to share. I'll hand back to you, Nusrat.
Thank you so much, Aisha. It was very, very important and very crucial to hear some perspectives from the funder side and it's amazing the work that you're doing from CGRF and, working more towards implementation and rather than just, talking about that we will be doing this and that. So thank you for your insights. So next, we would like to call upon Ines Baktui. Ines was a former employee at the Stockholm Environment Institute and is currently a researcher and lecturer in human geography. Her research focuses on issues of effectiveness and fairness of climate finance for adaptation and loss and damage. So Ines, we would like to give you the floor to talk a little bit about how small and locally led grants can address loss and damage, as Aisha has mentioned before. So over to you, Ines.
Thank you, Nusrat. I'm trying to find the presentation on my laptop, which is open, but cannot see it for some reason. I will. Okay, I'm so sorry. I should have checked this before, but.
No problem.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to do it unless I quit Zoom and reconnect. So I will do it without the presentation, or if you can share it.
I can share it. Yeah, give
That would
me
be
1
amazing.
second.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I'm so sorry for that delay.
No, it's okay. No problem.
But in the meantime, I can introduce myself.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to speak today, and hello to everybody who has joined the session. My name is Ines Baktui. I am a PhD student, researcher, and lecturer at the University of Bonn, as Zoha presented, and I used to work with the Stockholm Environment Institute, and last year with Zoha, who presented, and with CGRF and their grant partners, I worked on a learning output that was aimed at learning about the small grants that they had funded on loss and damage through government money provided by the Scottish government, to learn how small and locally led grants can address loss and damage. Can I ask you to move to the next slide, please? So yes, Aisha has provided a magazine background, so I will go very fast, but basically in COP26, Scotland pledged 1 million British pounds for loss and damage, and asked CGRF to disperse this money with the objective of catalyzing more finance for addressing loss and damage, but also to learn and showcase what loss and damage finance and loss and damage action looks like to other funders, and to support local communities in developing their own approaches. So through the CGRF, they focused on those small and locally led grants. Aisha explained that they consider those grants medium range, but in the report we use the term small grants by comparison with funding that is provided, for instance, within UNFCCC funds, which consider small grants around like $1 million, which is a different scale. And I guess that the philanthropic funding that goes to local communities would fit within this loss and damage fund framing as more of a small scale type of funding. And we worked collaboratively with the recipients of those fundings, with the grant partners, to generate learning on what locally led action to address loss and damage look like. And they're all contributing authors of the report that you can see on the right part of the screen. And I will present some of the findings of the report. Next slide, please. Great. So just a quick explanation on the methodology that we used. We had a desk-based review of the documents that emerged from the work that has been done with the local partners by CGRF and by the Scottish government. We looked at the 5 main grants that have been disbursed by CGRF that are presented in dark green, and that span between 200,000 and 250,000 US dollars in different continents and regions of the world, knowing that, as Aisha just said, some of those grants were actually then regranted. And so UUSC in the Pacific and the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, which is a global group, regranted this money into smaller grants to local NGOs and civil society organizations. And at that level, we looked at 2 sub-grants for each. So Climate Talk and Temwenga in the Pacific, and Green Transformation 2050 and Women for Green Economy Movement Uganda in when it comes to the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition grants. And we wanted to focus on generating lessons and not doing monitoring and evaluation as it is done by mainstream UNFCCC funders, which tends to focus on processes and results with an aim of figuring out what's been done with the money and whether it followed the ambitions of the funders. But we wanted to look at a climate justice perspective. And so we relied on a set of principles to guide our learning work that we developed in 2022 that span from climate justice principles of procedural and distributive justice. And so looking at whether there is fairness in where the money comes from, how it is accessed, who receives it, and how the decision-making processes of using it are done, whether it's done in a fair way. Yes, next slide, please. And so based on those findings, based on this methodology, here is some things that we learned that we think can be that funders should be aware of, that because it can inform the work that they do on loss and damage. I see, I'm sorry, a typo on the title. It should be an and not a 6. The first one is that local grants and small-scale grants can play a crucial complementary role with large-scale country-level finance. The grants that we reviewed did a fantastic job at targeting specific individuals and groups, and particularly vulnerable or discriminated groups. I'm thinking, for instance, of women from in Uganda whose husbands, for instance, had left after climate impacts hit them, and that they had to cope with recovering from those disasters and not having enough resources or support to help with their household and their children. I'm thinking of physical isolation in the Pacific communities who benefited from this funding, who were quite remote and received rapid and acute support in this case. So yeah, it also played a very important role in providing rapid and acute support after disasters, because otherwise these processes can spend time, and it's been documented that government level funding can take years and sometimes even doesn't appear after a disaster has occurred. But also one of the very important elements is that they all centered human right-based approaches, even though it was not necessarily done explicitly with that framework in mind. That is what we observed, and I want to provide a concrete example with the next slide. So as Aisha explained, can I have the next slide, please? Great, amazing. As Aisha explained, one of the basis of the work that was done with the funders, nope, the one before, again before. Yes, amazing. The work that was done with the partners and with the affected communities relied on them having agency over what they wanted to use the funding for and implementing the activities that they decided on. So there was a whole process of consultation that was need-based. And we looked into those processes, and analyzing them, we realized that what came out is that they were all based on identifying social vulnerability issues, structures that really matched very well the fundamental human rights that exist and that are recognized at the UN level. And so we did this exercise of mapping the different needs identified against human rights to show the parallel and the fact that human rights frameworks can be used as a minimum basis for funders to think about what decent and comprehensive responses to loss and damage is, which is not just to rebuild after climate impact or to address climate vulnerability through adaptation, but it's truly addressing structural issues, social vulnerability issues. We worked with a common understanding with the partners on what finance for loss and damage should aim at. And what they brought up was ensuring human and environmental well-being, dignity, and agency. The idea of agency came back a lot in the analysis that we did. I'll get back to it later, of individuals and communities. And since we're talking about loss and damage, individual and communities that are suffering specifically from climate impacts through processes of self-determination. But I feel like if we got rid of the climate impact part, this definition could be very much applicable to any kind of aid support. So that's one of the important findings. Can I go to the next slide, please? Great. Yes, so I mentioned the importance of agency and the role of those needs assessments, and then implementation implementation of the project was done with the communities who were all particularly involved. There was a strong incentive in enabling them to build skills, to build capacity, and to build agency. Lamek is here to talk about the work that CARD did with communities affected by cyclones and storms in Malawi. But I remember him explaining us how the inhabitants working on diversifying their, on recovering their herding practices and on building more resilient constructions, taking into account future possible climate impacts, really enabled them to anticipate future impacts and not only just recover from the ones they had suffered from. Another example that came up is the work done by the different communities that received funding from UUSC, who organized to create advocacy groups for themselves so that their voice can be carried throughout the Pacific and also even at international levels, so that they can have their own rights recognized in the fight for climate justice in the context of loss and damage. Another issue was agency of migrant communities and trapped communities, speaking of people who decide or who cannot afford to migrate, and who started advocating for their own right in projects based in Bangladesh. So those projects may be small in size, but if they can build agency, if they're designed around the concept of building agency, they can have way longer impacts than just a concrete project that is a techno-fixing one, and that then will degrade with time because it does not have the resources to be maintained, etc. So enabling agency was a very important component of all the projects we reviewed. Can I go to the next slide? Yes, amazing. Also on just the one before, sorry. Yes. So third point is that the values of the funders, the partners, and the recipients matter in the outcome of projects. CGRF and the Scottish government from the onset, or at least that's what they explained to us, really wanted to support climate justice through their funding. And it has had an influence on how those projects have enrolled and how they've been conceived and how they've been implemented. And those early commitments to justice, fairness, and equity have created the space for testing new approaches, both in terms of practicing to respond to loss and damage, but also practices in project implementation. Several partners told us that they had the opportunity to try more involvement of local populations in their project, that they changed their projects, their project management structure. Thanks to those projects, the Scottish government also reported that it was very unusual for them to approve funding without having first a very detailed plan of what was going to be done on the ground, and that it required a leap of faith from them to do that, but that they hope that they can learn from it and replicate that in the future. Another dimension is the fact that CGRF explained that they rely on trust with their partners on the ground, and that they try to prioritize partners who they've already worked with, which can lead to long-term benefits. That, for instance, the case with UUSC in the Pacific, and the fact that the budget for loss and damage came on top of, or at least UUSC provided to their partners this loss and damage funding as a top-up to the annual budget contributions that those communities receive anyway, and that because they have this certainty that they can act without knowing if they will receive more money in the future, they could identify longer-term strategies, they could better embed those loss and damage actions into their existing projects, and they anticipate to have longer-term impacts thanks to that. And one of the examples that came out of it, and that's the next slide, please, that was developed by UUSC and their local partners, is this monitoring, evaluation, and learning set of indicators that aims to identify whether projects contribute or activities contribute to systemic change that they developed all together. That's one of the outputs of their project, and it shows how this change of paradigm, this embracing of radical change and long-term partnership can enable further transformation of climate finance architecture, hopefully. Can I go to the next slide? Thanks. I think it's the last point in terms of the finding, and yeah, Zoha mentioned it. One of the big learnings from our work is that it is very unuseful to try to separate adaptation from loss and damage on the ground. When it comes to activities implemented, the partners were not asked to explain whether they thought it was adaptation or loss and damage, if it was ex ante, ex post. It was all a mix, and they told us that they thought that it belonged to both. Similarly, they also explained to us that they don't necessarily think that this distinction between economic and non-economic losses and damages on the ground makes much sense, and that it can complicate things. While those separations conceptually are important at a political level when it comes to framing things under climate justice perspective, they can become an issue with accessing funding on the ground if it creates more silos. So planting mangroves, for instance, or doing activities to rebuild while anticipating the next climate impact. So making buildings more resilient by the same occasion, does it fall within adaptation or loss and damage? Does it really matter in the end? And the fact that the funding did not care so much about that, as long as it contributed to the well-being and the resilience of those populations, what came out is that it really helped them. Can I go to the next slide? Amazing. I just wanted to point on a few challenges and limitations met by the partners. So one is a limitation of small grants. Their short period and size, of course, limited what affected communities could do. And they had to make sometimes short-term choices, which could lead to maladaptation. Nonetheless, those small grants, because there was so much stress on them being locally led and that they enabled needs assessments, they also identified longer term needs that could not be covered by the grant, but that could be used as a basis for other funding projects at a larger scale that could be funded, for instance, by the government or by larger scale funders and organizations. And we also noted that some lacked a robust exit plan, that the ones that did the best were the ones who were integrated into longer term annual funding, but that once again, capacity and agency building components improved these components. Linked to the limited scale and time, a consequence of that is that psychological support was often sidelined, and that all the partners insisted that they would like to address that further in the future. And of course, ensuring fair representation in locally led processes is challenging. And it took a lot of effort for some partners to make sure that individuals and groups within the local communities who face social, economic, and physical access barriers could be involved equally at an equal level. In Uganda, and the project in Uganda, we heard that, yes, that customs made it difficult for the project partners to talk to women, even though women were at the core of their project, and they had to find sidelines, and it took them a lot of time. For instance, yes. What else? Oh, yes, on migration, something that came up, and it's one of the things that came the most when it comes to migration is that it was extremely hard to find appropriate, safe, and affordable grounds and to acquire them for relocation activities. It was expensive and difficult for political reasons, but also because suitable land becomes more and more rare in situations of biodiversity degradation and climate impacts. And that the various projects that dealt with migration stressed how difficult that was, but I'm sure Lamek can also talk about that, because that was one of the points that he raised in Malawi, in the project in Malawi. And yes, one thing that we could not assess in our work, but that we anticipated as maybe it can become a barrier, or there's a trade-off here, is that working in long-term partnerships is beneficial and was beneficial in the projects were reviewed, but it could in some case if not well managed, generate gatekeeping if it prevents new joiners from also accessing funding. But that is hypothetical and it's just anticipating how things could go wrong. Last slide. Yes, amazing. And yeah, recommendations for funders who I hope are here, recipients of loss and damage finance, including national government actors and the Loss and Damage Fund board. Our first recommendation is for them to integrate small and locally led grants in their portfolio as mechanisms for assessing local needs, for enabling rapid action in targeted spaces, for piloting new approaches, and for building the capacity and agency of specific vulnerable groups or in specific locations. The second advice is for them to embed flexible provisions for non-economic losses and damages and psychological supports aspects of loss and damage. Non-economic losses and damages, it's really hard to anticipate what they will be, and they can also addressing them also passes through funding addressing economic losses and damages. Nonetheless, just having provisions for extra activities that might arise as the projects are being implemented could be beneficial, including for psychological support. Those small grants are not sufficient in themselves, and they require to be complemented with larger scale flexible and programmatic finance instruments for longer term reconstruction for certain needs that cannot be addressed by small grants. We covered that. Recipient countries of loss and damage finance should, I don't know what the right term here is, disseminate a share to the local level as part of their national recovery plans. And the Loss and Damage Fund of the UNFCCC could enable small grants, for instance, in the forms of enhanced direct access finance or a small grants window. So I covered that before, so I'm not going to expand. Yes, make it a priority for partners involved to have community-driven approaches, to have bottom-up democracy, and to embark climate justice and human rights framework to their work. And finally, please ensure that adaptation and loss and damage response can be funded jointly without creating a burden to the recipient countries, organizations, and people, and prioritize the well-being of the affected people above needs for accounting and to try to create more bridges between the existing funds that exist so that it becomes easier for people to receive appropriate and timely response. That is it for me. Thank you so much. And don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Ines. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm sure the report that you have co-produced is also very insightful. So with that, we would like to move on to our next speaker. So for our next speaker, we have Ms. Beatrice Rosario. Beatrice is a specialist in social projects dedicated to environmental preservation in Fondo Casa, which is basically a socio-environmental organization. And she plays a very crucial role in focusing its efforts on managing projects which is aimed towards prevention and fighting of forest fires, which is a very important impact that we normally see in the form of losses and damages. So I think for Beatrice, we have an interpretation option. So everyone, I would request all the participants to choose onto the channel that they want to listen to. They can, if there are Portuguese speakers, you can listen to the Portuguese version, or you can move on to the English version. So over to you, Beatrice.
Olá, bom dia. Obrigada pelo convite. É um prazer estar aqui hoje. Eu sou Beatriz, falando diretamente do Sul Global, no Brasil, representando o Fundo Casa Socioambiental. Eu queria pedir, por favor, se puder compartilhar a tela.
Beatrice, I think you can share, but if you are facing issues, then I can also share from here. Would you like me to share?
Pode compartilhar para mim, por favor?
Okay, sure.
Obrigada. Thank you. So, eu sou Beatriz, então, né, representando hoje o Fundo Casa Socioambiental, que é uma organização que iniciou suas atividades em 2005, formado por um grupo de ambientalistas, e desde então busca promover a conservação, a sustentabilidade ambiental, a democracia, o respeito aos direitos socioambientais e a justiça, por meio do apoio financeiro e fortalecimento de capacidades de iniciativas da sociedade civil no Brasil e no sul global. E para isso nós desenvolvemos uma poderosa rede de apoio a pequenas iniciativas da sociedade civil. É uma rede que mobiliza recursos, fornece suporte e fortalece as capacidades dessas organizações, dessas comunidades, garantindo uma autonomia cada vez maior para esses grupos, né, que estão espalhados aqui no Brasil e por toda a América do Sul. Nós acreditamos na transformação, que a transformação ela parte de um processo de escuta, né? E por isso nós ouvimos os verdadeiros protagonistas de cada causa que nós abraçamos, que são aqueles que têm as suas vidas diretamente afetadas por qualquer alteração no território onde vivem. Nós temos experiência em fazer com que os recursos da filantropia cheguem até os grupos comunitários de forma que eles garantam sua autonomia, de forma menos burocrática, né? E com isso nós desenvolvemos uma metodologia de apoio e monitoramento que considera as dinâmicas desses territórios. Pode passar para o próximo, por favor. Bom, então, falando um pouco sobre perdas e danos, o nosso apoio a perdas e danos, esse é um eixo estratégico dentro do nosso. Faz parte do enfrentamento de emergências climáticas, que é um eixo estratégico que nós estamos trabalhando dentro do Fundo Casa. E dentro desse eixo estratégico, nós desenvolvemos um programa de prevenção e combate a incêndios florestais, observando o aumento alarmante ano após ano no Brasil, e também com a chegada de diversos pedidos emergenciais dos grupos comunitários, das brigadas voluntárias, das comunidades locais, porém, quando os incêndios já estavam descontrolados, né? E nós compreendemos que esses apoios emergenciais, eles não eram eficazes para conter os incêndios por completo, né? E com isso nós vimos a necessidade de apoiar esses grupos de forma mais estruturada, de forma planejada, considerando seus saberes tradicionais, as dinâmicas dos seus territórios, considerando que um equipamento para chegar no interior da Amazônia exige uma logística complexa de combustível, de diversas horas de barco, primeiramente para ir fazer a compra desse equipamento e depois para a chegada desse equipamento até a comunidade, né? O acesso desses grupos, dessas comunidades a cursos de formação para brigadistas, por exemplo, cursos que garantam a segurança dessas pessoas que vão estar atuando, né? E as instruções de uso dos equipamentos, então existem diversas particularidades em cada território, né? O Pantanal, que também é um importante bioma do Brasil, nós podemos usar como exemplo, em 2020 teve mais de 30% do seu território queimado. E assim como a Amazônia é um território que possui particularidades na sua logística de prevenção e combate aos incêndios, né? Pois possui áreas onde só podem ser acessadas com barcos de pequeno porte, que é algo que as comunidades muitas vezes não possuíam. e com isso precisavam aguardar essa primeira resposta a esse foco de incêndio pelos bombeiros militares, pelos órgãos governamentais. Porém, essas respostas, elas podem demorar até um dia para chegar, né? Pois a gente precisa considerar as dimensões continentais que o Brasil possui, né? E também os diversos focos que surgem ao mesmo tempo. Então, é algo onde o governo não consegue dar conta. E ter essas comunidades, ter essas brigadas locais, ter esses grupos preparados para uma pronta resposta a esses incêndios nos seus territórios é super importante, né? Evitando que esses incêndios saiam de controle. Mas, mais uma vez, né, não adianta esse brigadista estar formado e ter algum equipamento, mas não ter o veículo necessário para chegar até aquele foco, né? Ou vice-versa. Então, foi visando essas ações preparatórias, preventivas e mais estruturantes que nós iniciamos nossa experiência de apoio na temática de apoiar grupos de base no enfrentamento de emergências climáticas provocadas a partir dos incêndios florestais. Pode passar para o próximo, por favor. Essa é uma foto muito interessante de um brigadista fazendo o combate ao incêndio em um momento extremo. Pode passar, por favor. Bom, então, em 2021, nós iniciamos nossa trajetória nesse eixo de apoiar prevenção e combate a incêndios florestais. Nós recebemos, via chamadas públicas no nosso site, 277 projetos, porém, com os recursos disponíveis, só foi possível apoiar 145 deles, né? E essas convocatórias tiveram com base o reconhecimento da importância dos biomas, com foco no bioma amazônico, para o equilíbrio climático do planeta, para a conservação da biodiversidade e para a garantia do direito de todos os seres vivos a um ambiente saudável, seguro, reconhecendo como fundamental também a participação e o conhecimento tradicional dos povos indígenas, das brigadas voluntárias locais, que fazem parte desses territórios, são conhecedores fiéis de seus territórios e sabem as dinâmicas locais, né? Bom, pode seguir, por favor. Próximo. Os projetos apoiados estavam contemplados em 3 linhas temáticas de apoio, sendo elas a estruturação e fortalecimento de brigadas voluntárias e comunitárias, como, por exemplo, a realização de cursos de treinamento, compra de equipamentos, tecnologias como drones para monitoramento, veículos para acessar as áreas atingidas. Uma segunda linha de ações de manejo integrado do fogo, como monitoramento dos focos de incêndio, ações de educação ambiental, queimas prescritas e controladas de materiais combustíveis, formações diversas como resgate de fauna, primeiros socorros, ações de recuperação de áreas degradadas e reflorestamento, né? E uma terceira linha de mobilização e engajamento de denúncias em casos de incêndios criminosos, né? Muitas vezes os incêndios são utilizados de forma criminosa para violação de direitos, invasões de território. Então, essa terceira linha buscava apoiar esses grupos que sofriam com essas causas. Próximo, por favor. O próximo slide. Bom, dos 145 projetos apoiados, totalizam 4 milhões, aproximadamente 4.281.000 reais, que é aproximadamente 857 mil dólares. Próximo, por favor. Desses 145 projetos, 58 são de povos indígenas, né? Essa é uma foto de uma brigada 100% indígena, 100% feminina, que nós ajudamos a formar, foi um projeto apoiado pelo Fundo Casa, e nós vimos, né, esse fundamental reconhecimento dos povos indígenas para a manutenção dos biomas, né, principalmente do bioma amazônico, e a importância para o equilíbrio climático que esses povos indígenas possuem, né, conservando a biodiversidade local, garantindo o direito dos seres vivos a um ambiente saudável, seguro, e as terras indígenas na Amazônia, elas são grandes protetoras, grandes barreiras contra o desmatamento. Bom, porém, né, essas terras indígenas, esses territórios indígenas vivem em constante ameaça e pressão, sendo alvo de invasões, de grilagem de terras, além da exploração ilegal de produtos florestais e minérios. E é muito importante a resistência que os povos indígenas fazem em seus territórios, né, preservando e garantindo esse direito a um ambiente saudável, né? Bom, os indígenas se arriscam no combate aos incêndios, evitando que as chamas se espalhem, né, a ponto de se tornarem incontroláveis, muitas vezes sem os equipamentos e treinamentos adequados para esse trabalho. Então, o apoio a esses projetos garantiu que esses grupos estivessem estruturados, treinados para essa primeira resposta. Pode passar para o próximo, por favor. Próximo slide, por favor. Certo. Bom, e sabendo que as perdas e danos, elas não ocorrem somente no âmbito dos incêndios florestais, nos últimos anos nós estamos ampliando nossas frentes de apoio também, observando as situações de secas extremas, como por exemplo nessa foto à esquerda nós temos um exemplo da seca de outubro de 2023 na Amazônia, onde o Rio Negro, que é um dos principais afluentes do Rio Amazonas, alcançou o nível mais baixo em 121 anos, né? E à direita, as cheias, as inundações avassaladoras que vêm acometendo diversos estados do Brasil. E buscando atender essas demandas que vêm dos territórios, apoiar, para além do momento de emergência, as comunidades que enfrentam, né, ano após ano, esses desafios. E tudo isso nós precisamos pensar que antecede um evento climático extremo, né? Todas as ações que antecedem, que previnem, precisam de tempo de planejamento, de implementação, para que as comunidades tenham oportunidade, né, e condições de se prepararem para esses eventos, seja dos incêndios, das secas, das chuvas extremas. Tudo isso tem relação com a adaptação climática, com as comunidades se adaptarem para enfrentar esse período daquela determinada emergência climática e perdas e danos que esses eventos climáticos causam. As perdas para essas comunidades têm sido altíssimas e muitas vezes o poder público não consegue dar conta de financiar, de lidar com os impactos causados pela mudança do clima, e os mecanismos de financiamento estão distantes das comunidades locais, muitas vezes. Pode passar para o próximo, por favor? Bom, então, projetar esse financiamento, né, desenhar essa estratégia robusta para financiar perdas e danos, né, os pedidos, as perdas e danos, elas podem ser as mais variadas possíveis, né, como, por exemplo, demonstrado na imagem anterior, em alguns estados na Amazônia, cheia extrema, os pedidos são de apoio humanitário, como compra de alimentos básicos, acesso à água potável para a sobrevivência dessas famílias, né? E precisamos sempre levar em consideração toda a logística para a chegada desses alimentos até essas comunidades que são extremamente impactadas em sua segurança alimentar, pois como os eventos climáticos extremos, eles perdem seus roçados, suas plantações locais da agricultura familiar, perdem a sua capacidade produtiva por ter a terra atingida por esse evento extremo, o acesso à água potável para o consumo e para o preparo de alimentos fica extremamente escasso, então são diversas perdas, né, e danos que vêm a surgir dos eventos climáticos extremos. E os grandes fundos, tanto nacionais, vinculados ao governo federal, quanto internacionais que existem hoje, estão extremamente distantes dessas comunidades, né? Pois também os fundos enfrentam dificuldades de fazer o recurso chegar de uma maneira que essas comunidades tenham condições de se preparar para isso, né? Também enfrentam barreiras como, por exemplo, a barreira linguística, as barreiras de comunicação com essas comunidades, muitas não têm acesso à internet, um transporte recorrente até um município onde tenha acesso à internet, né? Barreiras de conhecimento dessas estruturas locais, e ao mesmo tempo as comunidades enfrentam as barreiras burocráticas de acesso a esses fundos, muitas vezes se tornando difícil a sua participação ativa, né, e no aproveitamento desses recursos. Posso exemplificar o Fundo Casa e outros fundos locais do Sul Global, no contexto das mudanças climáticas, que são fundamentais para o financiamento de projetos e iniciativas que promovam essa adaptação, a mitigação e apoiam estratégias e ações para lidar com as perdas e danos, né, causados por essas mudanças, por serem fundos locais, por estarem próximos, por possuírem um conhecimento mais intrínseco das estruturas locais, né, permitindo que as comunidades locais implementem de forma autônoma, de forma descomplicada, as suas práticas e tecnologias sustentáveis, inovadoras, né, dentro dos campos de manejo florestal, da agricultura de baixo carbono, da gestão sustentável de recursos hídricos e promoção de energias renováveis e muitas outras, né? Essas iniciativas não contribuem apenas para a proteção do meio ambiente, mas para a melhoria das condições de vida das comunidades locais, e reverberam, ecoam em soluções planetárias, né, que todos nós nos beneficiamos e buscamos. E, claro, deve existir um diálogo e uma colaboração entre o governo, a sociedade civil e a academia. A academia tem se apresentado muito com tecnologias na questão de acesso à água potável para as comunidades, com estudos e algumas tecnologias para como trabalhar essa questão, mas ainda é um desafio, é um caminho a ser construído, e é de extrema importância, né, que o financiamento chegue para essas comunidades poderem se preparar para esses eventos, bem como a reconstrução dos danos efetivamente. Portanto, nós estamos num processo de aprendizagem de como esses recursos devem chegar, quando devem chegar até as comunidades locais, explorando todas as abordagens mais eficientes para democratizar os fundos, promover e fazer com que seja uma distribuição justa e acessível desses recursos. É isso. Muito próximo, por favor. Muito obrigada, obrigada por essa oportunidade de estar aqui hoje e poder compartilhar um pouco com vocês a experiência do Fundo Casa. Um abraço, obrigada.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, for that presentation. That was very useful for us to understand how what Brazil and Latin America is doing in terms of addressing and working towards loss and damage. So thank you so much. So for the interest of time, I'll now move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Lamek Nakoma. So Lamek is the Deputy Program Manager for the Church's Action in Relief and Development. He has vast experience in working with climate change affected communities in Malawi. So Lamek, we would like to give you the floor to give us a little bit of insights on the research work and the report that you have done. So over to you, Lamek.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to make a presentation. It's not a research actually, but it's an example of the project that we did on loss and damage. I shared my presentation. I don't know whether it can be shared so that I also go by that presentation I shared already. If not, then I can also just make a presentation from what I had already prepared. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so what I'm going to do, I will speak a bit of what we did under loss and damage. Yes, we did an example of a project with funding from CJRF. It was a project which we were actually responding to the impact of Cyclone Anna, which affected the communities here in Malawi, and we did it in Chikwawa. This is in the southern part of Malawi, and our project actually was actually building transitional shelters, as the Aisha explained. So in that project, we made sure that everything we did was locally led. Communities were at the center of whatever we are doing. And for us to construct a transitional shelter, which could actually withstand the next cyclones, we made sure that the affected community had to relocate to places which were a bit elevated to the higher ground, so that during the next cyclone, they were not affected. But also the transitional shelters had some resilient features, like it had an overhanging roof, it had a high foundation. It also, as I mentioned, it was also constructed on a raised foundation. And also it had a foundation surrounding the whole structure. And apart from the transitional shelters, we also had a component where we supported the affected household with the goats, which were distributed on a person program. So those were the two aspects of the project. We also had a component of tree planting, where we also wanted to make sure that surrounding the transitional shelters which we constructed, people also planted some trees around it. Now, coming to my presentation, I was trying to explain how a local organization, or an organization which is implementing, or an organization which is trying to seek funding, or maybe there's a certain organization which is trying to fund a local organization to work on loss and damage. What are some of the things that maybe can be considered? So if you look at my outline of my presentation, I am talking about the requirements from the funder or partner, implementation arrangement, monitoring of the project activities, and also sharing of the report, both financial and the narrative, but also making sure that all the processes being carried out are locally led during the implementation. So these are some of the things that we must look into when we want to implement a successful loss and damage project to the affected communities. Next slide. Yeah, so implementation arrangement. So our work, for example, which we did under loss and damage, we collaboratively work with the relevant stakeholders at district and the community levels. For the project to be successful under loss and damage, we need to make sure that we work with the district officials and also certain structures at community level, but also we need to make sure that the affected people are placed at the center of the implementation. They are also part of the decision making we are doing under that project. But we also make sure that we have some quarterly review meetings with the stakeholders to improve the implementation arrangement within the communities. And also whatever we promise that we are going to implement this, we implement according to plan. Next slide. Yeah, so in terms of monitoring the project activities, we also had some joint monitoring visit to project sites with the district stakeholders to make sure that if there are checks and balances, we do together with our officials from the council We were also sharing achievements under the loss and damage activities, both at district and also with our funding partners. We also shared the baseline report with the stakeholders and also the funding partners, but also sharing just the general progress to our partners and district stakeholders. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of sharing, the report, the financial narrative, there's always need to share the financial report to the funding partners with all the supporting documents for the procurements, and also final narrative reported also to be shared, which should also agree with the financial report to the funding partners, and at the same time meeting the deadlines. And also sharing case stories, if there are good stories to share, there's also that need to share with the funding partner, the stories which are outstanding from the communities. Next slide, please. And also making sure that all processes are local led. So how can we achieve that? We before you do the, sorry, just a minute. Yeah, so before you make a proposal, or you make the full project on loss and damage, for you to make the project a local led, you need to make sure that you do needs assessment, so that you really tackle issues that are in line with loss and damage to the community, so that indeed when you look at the needs within the communities, there's numerous needs on loss and damage. But together with the communities, you prioritize which ones you really need to do, so that you really address the needs by the affected community. And also, if there's any activity taking place within the communities have to be aware. If there are certain lessons or challenges, we need to share those ones together with the affected people in the community. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Over the chair.
Thank you so much, Lamek. It was very important to hear from the local perspective on, what are the needs from the ground. So next, I would like to call upon Victoria. So Victoria is the head of secretary at BASE and a programmatic coordinator at Avina Foundation. So we would like to hear from her on some of the work that Avina Foundation is doing towards the new track on designing the Loss and Damage Fund. So Victoria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nusrat, and all the colleagues from ICAR for inviting me to be part of this event. I'm really happy to have the chance to share with all of you in these few minutes that we have left before we finish the session. And also thank my fellow colleagues that have been presenting some of the results of the work that they were doing and they are doing. I've already learned so much from hearing from you, so thank you. Well, greetings to all from Argentina. I'm going to take this couple of minutes to share about the work that we are doing in the BASE initiative. So the BASE initiative is coordinated by Fundación Avina, and mainly BASE was created with the purpose of providing inputs to try to provide answers to one of the main challenges that we understand that the communities face when trying to access the climate funds. That is, how do these communities explain what we call the climate rationale? Basically, how we can justify that a project that is being funded is a climate project. So by a three-pillar strategy, we are implementing different track of grant schemes in the Global South. And in the implementation of these climate solutions, we learn which could be alternative ways to understand how these climate rationale can be simplified, can be done faster, and of course, more meaningful for communities. And then we want to take these lessons that we learned to the climate finance, the international climate finance ecosystems, to promote changes in the business as usual ways in which climate finance is deployed directly to the communities. So what Nusrat was sharing before, and what I want to provide more detail, is the second track that we are starting to design, that is going to be focused on loss and damage that is caused by forest fires that are triggered by climate change in tropical forests of the global south. So mainly our focus is going to be to inform the practice for funding loss and damage, and with basically two main objectives. The first one is to identify a critical mass of collaboration and active participation from different stakeholders around the world that are working on loss and damage. And the second one is to provide practical inputs to the climate finance ecosystem, and specifically to the loss and damage fund that has now been established. So by doing that, or with that purpose in mind, we have established a working group of experts and different actors from all over the world that have been convened in a first meeting in Dubai, where we got together in the sidelines of COP to really discuss among each other which are the main questions that the design of a grant scheme should ask in order to provide and really have a good design of on how a grant scheme should look like to provide these inputs to the loss and damage fund. And this was a really interesting discussion which led us to identifying those key things that we need to work and put more focus on and deep dive in future conversations. And for that, we have now convened this group of experts to a workshop that is going to be held next week in Brazil, in Rio, where we are going to be having conversations with experts on climate finance, loss and damage, firefighters, representatives from communities that have been affected by forest fires, also experts on wildfires, climate scientists. Well, a wide range of stakeholders that can help us and to really design collaboratively on how should a loss and damage track that is going to be implemented by BASE could effectively provide inputs to the loss and damage fund of the UNFCCC. So mainly our focus is going to be that. We are going to ask ourselves within these 3 days during the workshop of how can the track that BASE is going to implement can provide specific inputs to the loss and damage fund that could hopefully take these lessons learned about how innovative approaches, flexibility, and trust can be upscaled. And only to finish, I really want to highlight things that have been appearing in my fellow presenters, colleagues that presented before, about how important it is to build upon each other's efforts and to strengthen and scale up the work that we as organizations and institutions in the Global South are putting into practice, and how we should work with each other instead of thinking about how to reinvent the wheel, and have this flexibility to test these new and innovative approaches. So I leave it at that. And over to you, Nusrat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. So this is, again, a very interesting initiative that Veena Foundation has taken, and we would really like to, be a part of. And as you mentioned that, if we can use all the forces, and we today are in our panel, we have a set of different actors who are working in different scopes. So it's great to have everyone here today. So with that, we're almost towards the end of the session, although we're running a bit over time. So I'll give about 5 minutes of time. If anyone has any questions for any of the speakers, feel free to unmute yourself. So we're willing to take questions for 5 minutes. We don't have much time. So anyone? I guess everyone's very tired. Okay. Even if you don't have questions now, when we do send out the materials and the report, if you have any queries, feel free to knock us so that we can tag you with the relevant speaker. And we would love to engage and liaise accordingly. So with that, now I would like to invite Saqib Haq, who is our managing director at the International Center for Climate Change and Development, and also coordinating our climate finance program, to share a few words and close the session. So over to you, Saqib.
Thank you, Nusrat, and thank you to all our panelists for their very interesting remarks as well as their very concrete ideas. So I echo, as Nusrat mentioned, that if you're able to, please do take in the information that's in the chat and how to reach out to our speakers. I believe several website links and emails have been shared. If you would like to, please also use our conference platform to get in touch with the speakers. If you have any questions or queries that come into your mind, either today on today's topic or anything else from some of the other sessions, and you would like us to sort of reflect on talk about some of those issues, please use the community board and the message boards to do so, and reach out to us as well as by email once we've sent out the session notes and so on. Please feel free to reach out. As we know that this is a very emerging topic, so I think a lot of our sessions have kind of pinpointed and focused on the upcoming new fund, the loss and damage fund, to come through. And we're hoping some of these concrete evidences from the presentations will be ideas that the committee that's setting up the fund and working on the guiding instruments and funding modalities are really able to look at some of these examples and create a fund that's actually fit for purpose. So as we've seen from some of the other previous funds, the long-standing adaptation fund, as well as now also quite a long-standing green climate fund, that they've really not been able to sort of tackle the community inclusivity angles in being able to reach out to organizations on the ground or local organizations that are even formally sort of established, but perhaps associations and networks, but are doing good work. And they're using whatever meager resources they're able to in being able to tackle the issues that they're having to deal with day in, day out in their own local communities and context. And we're hoping that the new funding mechanisms, as well as the broader UNFCCC Climate Finance Standing Committee recommendations, are places where we'll be able to pitch these sorts of case studies and these examples and really try and change the funding modality that we've been seeing that have become a little bit difficult and not fit for purpose in having local communities be involved in being able to receive funding for the initiatives that they're taking. And as many of the speakers have also mentioned, that this is also a very broad topic. We're looking at one concrete example, such as the new fund coming up, but there are other elements. There's outside funding that comes in that aren't even under the UNFCCC. They're coming through bilateral modes. They're coming through foundations, philanthropies, and organizations that perhaps are a little bit quicker than moving through UN bodies. So our former director and founder, Dr. Salimul Haq, would often tell us that anything coming out of the COP and any decisions coming through them move at the UN time, which is not really everybody else's time. It doesn't really fit any timeline that people can see some transformative changes. It's very incremental, and it takes a long time to get these decisions and these guiding instruments and memos decided so that funding actually starts flowing. And traditionally, a lot of the previous fundings, that's one of the challenges that have come out, is that it takes a very, very long time for you to actually secure any amount of funding. And oftentimes, a lot of the initiatives that you're trying to take place really can't fit into that timeline. The emergency is much greater than the funding required that comes through. So there are also scopes for us to use these case studies, use these initiatives and these great examples that we're coming through from partners that have presented today, as well as many of you in the audience, on how to use these other bodies outside of the UN channel that are also contributing to taking climate action, that are also contributing to enhancing community support, enhancing community activities, and initiatives that are really, really taking place on critical matters. And in many cases, these are not large parts of funding that they require. These types of support at the local level are often something that major donors sort of overlook, because the administrative burden of making it into smaller grants, smaller projects, smaller funding going to one local institution administratively takes a lot of a burden. And so they basically just overlook these. But there are other entities, there are other foundations, there are other philanthropic areas, there are other private channels where we could be taking these sorts of initiatives at a much more quicker rate and a much more comprehensive initiative. And so some of these lessons that we've been taking here today, we're hoping to also take it to the broader financing spectrum, not just looking at the climate aspect. As we go through some of the conventions coming in now, we're starting to see a lot of overlaps between climate and humanitarian and traditional development projects, as well as other areas. Disaster management has been something that has always been on the fringes of loss and damage. And now there's a big need for looking at how these sorts of funding programs are not only event specific, not only project specific, but holistic, looking at it more programmatically, looking at it at the issue at hand, what needs to be tackled, and what are the timeframes that we need to be thinking about these fundings, not just a pot of money that comes in when a disaster has struck, but looking at it as a whole year of funding that needs to come through, so that that disaster is not as harrowing and devastating as it would otherwise have been. And so there are other scopes for us to be looking at where these initiatives should be placed. And hopefully, as I keep mentioning, if there are ideas and case studies that you would like us to look into, that you would like us as researchers and academics that are working on these areas, practitioners that are looking at examples, trying to be a little bit innovative in our programs and our projects, please do give us some inputs and feedback. We'll be happy to liaise with you, happy to have a little one-on-one, perhaps meet face-to-face in one of the fringes of these conferences or conventions or a workshop. Bangladesh, where we are based, we're happy to host anybody. If you're willing to come by, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to host a team of you to come by, look at some of the initiatives and projects that we're working on, and look at how we can synergize and collaborate. So with that in mind, I'll hand back to Nusrat at the end of a very interesting session. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much, Sakipai. So that was the exact words that we needed to hear. So thank you everyone for joining today. I would request everyone, particularly the speakers, to kindly open your camera so that we can take a quick photo with everyone to commemorate this session. So great. Thank you so much. So can we have the photographs on 3, 2, 1? Done? Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And hopefully we'll keep in touch. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.